there's so many other tasks that you have to do that take you away from teaching and take you from that creative side of making lessons interesting or the learning relevant. And I really struggled with that because my heart was really in making learning interesting and engaging and making students see the relevance of what they were learning. But I felt like I didn't have that kind of time to develop and be creative in that way. And like a lot of teachers will confirm that the curriculum demands are so strong and so imposing that you don't have a lot of wiggle room. You've got an enormous amount of content to cover. And by the time you're done, it just feels like you're, trying to race to the end of something. And so I would say overall, it was that there was too much to do that didn't resemble what I loved about teaching.
A few years ago, I started writing a fictitious story based on my time as an educator. It is called Taught, and the story was partially inspired out of anger and frustration fueled by burnout. Okay, actually it was more than partially inspired by anger and frustration. But Taught has also become a vehicle for me to tell what I thought at the time, and in some ways continue to think, was and is the real story of teaching. I now realize that my perspective is not everyone's perspective, but there are some pieces of Taught that resonated with many educators. This podcast is an extension of that story, and I, a former teacher, will interview other educators asking them to share how they really feel about the current state of education. Why are so many teachers burn out? Why are so many, like me, leaving the field? We likely won't solve any problems or come up with any solutions, but we can create a community of voices that maybe begin the conversation around how educators can take back teaching. I'm Melissa LaFour. Welcome to Taught, the podcast. Today's episode is part 1 of 2 parts. Make sure that you tune in next week on Friday for part 2 of my interview with Isabel. For today, enjoy part 1. Today I have Isabelle Delatour with me. Isabel has been working in education for over 20 years. She started out in a classroom in London, and despite loving what she did, Isabel found herself at the point of burnout. She decided to make a change and begin forging a similar but different path for herself. Isabel, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're quite welcome. I'm very excited to do this. You're my first educator, like someone who is still in the system and has taught in the classroom quite a bit. I did have another British person.
Mm-hmm.
But he taught in a different area. So I'm excited for what you're going to bring to the program today. So what made you become an educator?
Well, actually, my decision to train to become a teacher came long after I actually started teaching or working in education with young people. I sort of from university always tried to follow my heart, at risk of sounding corny, but I always was drawn to working with young people, and education just appealed to me, even if they were educational projects outside of the classroom, like agricultural projects with children, working in language projects, working on educational projects, which I did, in Brazil and Tanzania, and never really thinking of myself as a teacher or wanting to be a teacher. I was always very close to education. And I guess with a lot of good things, what precedes is a crisis of sorts. And I was finishing up my master's in international development, and something about it just didn't sit well with me. I just felt that the job paths that were open to me didn't really suit me because of the kind of interactions I'd have with people. And I woke up one morning literally with a eureka moment. It was as clear as day to me that what I wanted to do was to be a teacher. And from that moment, I did not look back once. I within that week, I'd applied. It was sort of the end of the deadline stage for those kind of programs. And I was accepted shortly thereafter. And that's how I got into education. I think it was a long road to me just admitting to myself what I wanted, but never really seeing it clearly until that moment.
I think it's interesting because I actually hear this from a lot of educators that they had a winding path to kind of get to the
Mm,
actual teaching, working with students. But I think sometimes because education and learning is at the heart of everything we do,
yes, yes,
sometimes it is that winding path that's necessary to get us to that place that's like, oh, this is where I can do my best work, is in the
absolutely.
classroom. But yeah, I hear this
Absolutely.
from a lot of teachers and paras and administrators that they started out in other areas.
Mm.
So, what made you decide to leave the classroom? Because right now you are not currently teaching in a classroom setting in a school, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I really love the classroom. I really love working with young people. And I guess it came to a point where I felt that uh, the thing that I loved the most was not what I was doing the most of. And I'm sure a lot of teachers will say that the actual act of teaching, obviously, beside the contact time, there's so many other tasks that you have to do that take you away from teaching and take you from that creative side of making lessons interesting or the learning relevant. And I really struggled with that because my heart was really in making learning interesting and engaging and making students see the relevance of what they were learning. But I felt like I didn't have that kind of time to develop and be creative in that way. And like a lot of teachers will confirm that the curriculum demands are so strong and so imposing that you don't have a lot of wiggle room. You've got an enormous amount of content to cover, and by the time you're done, it just feels like you're trying to race to the end of something. And so I would say overall it was that there was too much to do that didn't resemble what I loved about teaching. It took me too far away from that, and I felt like it really restricted me creatively.
Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast by Mel Robbins that actually my friend Amy Shamberg recommended that
Mm.
everyone listen to. But one of the things that Mel Robbins was saying, and this is kind of about finding your inner confidence, and she was saying you have to be authentic. And a pathway to finding out if you're being authentic is asking yourself, what are those things that energize you? And I thought about this in context of my teaching career because sometimes it's hard to sift out what it was I loved about teaching, because to be honest with you, by the time I got to the end, there was not much I loved about teaching.
Yeah,
I
for
mean,
sure.
honestly, I, but what you're saying, it was the piece I think that energized me when I sat down and I looked at, okay, this is what we have to learn this week. And my brain would get going. Oh, I could teach this. I could bring this in. I could show this
Hmm.
video. We could do this activity.
Hmm.
And I think you're 100% right. At least in the US system, we did number one, we didn't have time to do anything extra.
Hmm.
Number two, we were supposed to be doing everything the same way and with some really tight curriculum. Would you say the same is true in the UK?
Yes, I mean the curriculum is very prescribed. The students all over the country take the same test for their subjects, well, across the world, really, because GCSEs are offered worldwide. So it is very prescriptive. There is no flexibility amongst different parts of the country. It's very standard countrywide. So um, there's just not a lot of flexibility, even in the way you demonstrate your answers. It's a very most GCSEs you do a lot of writing, written subjects, and you write a lot of extended answers. So there's that whole content side and then that whole side of demonstrating your knowledge, which kids have to be trained to do. So between those two, the teacher doesn't have much time to say, oh, how I could really teach this and bring this this learning objective across the students. We could do a debate. We could do a mock UN or mock trial. No, you just, as much as you want to do it, the time to plan it, and when you weigh that up against, all the content that you could be delivering, the choice is already made for you. You've got to prioritize the content and just take it out of its fun and exciting box.
And I hate and love what you just said, but the content is already decided for you. I think that is, I love it because it's true, and I
Yeah.
hate it because it's true.
Yes.
Same in the U.S. systems. Can you speak a little bit about the GCSEs? Because you are my first friend who has
Mhm.
used this term with me. I was unfamiliar with them.
Yeah, well, it's a general certificate of education, and it's basically very different from the U.S. in the sense that at in year 10, so in year 9, students have to pick their subjects. Some of them are compulsory, and some of them are options. So let's say a student has about 3, 4 options. They could be languages, history, geography. Sciences are not options. You have to do them. Um, so whatever the options are, they choose them. At the end of year 11, they take a standardized test, which again, like I said, is the same for everybody across the world. I mean, there are different exam boards that have different exams, but essentially they are the same, in terms of standard, because that's all regulated. And when they finish, they have somewhere between 10 to 12 qualifications in the subjects, the most important being math and English. And you have to have a certain grade, would be a C, or what we have now is a number 4 if you're in the UK. And you really cannot progress much further unless you get a C in certain subjects. And if you want to go the academic route, you do something called A levels, and again, that's even tighter focus on 3 subjects, about 3, 4 subjects. So unlike the US system, where you kind of have this more liberal approach to learning bits of everything, the GCSE system the British system kind of funnels you and asks you to focus a little bit, quite a lot earlier than they do in the US. So you're already thinking of career paths in year 9 before you enter year 10, where you start your exam subjects. So it's an added pressure, and the grades matter. And I think another huge thing that I always felt was, I don't know, it's something that I felt disincentivized students to do consistently good work, is that there's no GPA. So students have this exam at the end. It's not always 100%. Sometimes there's coursework, but generally it's 60 to 100%, that one exam over 2 days. So there is no building of, um, you have no incentive necessarily to do good work throughout and build. And you do find those students, they're quite overconfident, and they think they'll just cram at the end. And I can tell you stories of students coming to me on the day of the exam asking me for clarification on points that they should have learned like a year before. So, I would say that then again also makes it harder for students, because there's a stress there, isn't there? There's from when they're very young, everybody's talking to them about this huge exam that they're going to have to take at the end of year 11. And that day comes, and of course, they're scared. It's been
Well,
built up. It's a monster.
I'm just thinking about the developmental brain here and how I was at, say, the age of 15. And, 2 weeks seemed like forever away.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever needed to be done 2 weeks from now, I would worry about that then. I mean, I think that the adolescent brain is very much in the here and now. So
Mm-hmm.
to be able for them to be able to make that connection, I'm sure is a little challenging. Just that
Oh, for
connection. And what we're
sure.
doing today is something I'm going to need to remember 2 years from now.
Absolutely. And then, think about the educator on that end is also having to push this agenda and make sure the kids are learning all this stuff and revisiting. And, I would say that and maybe other podcast guests have hinted toward this or said it outright, is that it seems that the onus overwhelmingly is on the teacher for the student to do well, and it's taken away this responsibility for the students to have some responsibility for themselves, and the way they study and their habits, and kind of linking, at least in the UK, linking student results to progression on the pay scale, which I mean just creates such um, it creates a very vicious circle of force feeding students this information, because, oh my God, if I try and teach it and they don't get it, just give it to them, so they can just swallow it and, beat it
Yeah.
right back out.
Well, as we've discussed in the US, we don't have those scores, at least right now, although there have been states and districts that have talked about doing it, but the student scores are not linked to the teacher pay. However, teachers do still have in the US that pressure. When students fail, a lot of times that can mean, we had a system in place, No Child Left Behind,
Mm-hmm.
or the early 2000s. And that was, your school is going to lose funding as a whole.
Right.
The teachers aren't going to lose money, but the whole school is going to lose funding, or you're going to be put on this improvement type plan if the students don't make a certain score. And guess what? We got to a place where no schools were making it, and they had to scrap the whole program
Mm-hmm.
because, as you stated, I mean, growth mindset theory from Carol Dweck says, when we are in those situations where we feel like we are in a high risk and in a position where we can make a mistake and it's high risk, we
Mm-hmm.
typically don't do well, right?
Yeah, sure.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the more the stakes get raised for educators and students, it's going to be harder for us to perform. Our brain's not set up to do that way. Once we get into that high
Absolutely.
risk zone, it's about fight or flight.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Typically making good decisions at that point. We're making life-saving decisions. So yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
I digress, but
No, that's an interesting point. And even what you said about, funding, losing funding in a school that's not doing well. I mean, it's almost sounds like the opposite should be done, because if the schools aren't doing well, oftentimes when students aren't doing well, there's so many factors, as we know, outside of school that contribute to that. And, taking away funding seems like the worst thing you could possibly do. You should be investing in all sorts of interventions or resources to turn that around.
well, I do feel that in the US, we do really enjoy a good punitive system. So
Mm,
very authoritarian, let's punish everybody. Anyway.
mm, interesting.
I've had to start adding a disclaimer at the beginning of the podcast, specifically to say views of the guests and the host do not necessarily represent.
Yeah, exactly. Do not.
So that's my opinion. We love a good punitive system in the US. That's not
That's all
everybody.
right. That's what podcasts are for.
That's right. Isabel, you have a very personal, your own burnout story. Can you share that story with us?
Yes, sure. You know, I don't know, Melissa, if you feel the way I do, but I think when you're teaching and you're in the thick of things, it's very hard to read yourself and your body and your emotions. Sometimes you just feel exhausted, and you kind of put everything under exhaustion, but actually there's a real pile up going on of a lot of different the lead up to burnout, in my opinion. And my burnout caught me completely off guard. I wouldn't describe myself as burnt out, just busy and tired, which I think a lot of professionals and parents can say. And
Absolutely.
it happened one morning. I would arrive at work about an hour early. I think I was always operating under a sort of low level anxiety, running through all the things I had to do in my head. But I was so used to this level of anxiety that it didn't really register as a problem. Um, and I remember arriving at work before anybody got there and opening my emails, and I was asked to pick up another lesson, so add another hours teaching to my timetable, which would be a one-to-one with a student, which, can be quite intense because there's no activity time really. It's very much working with this student, um, talking the whole hour and working through whatever their difficulties are. And I just started crying uncontrollably after I received this email. I mean, if you'd walked in that room, you'd think that somebody had died. I was crying uncontrollably, and I just thought to myself, I haven't got not even 1 ounce of energy, time, or headspace to deal with another student, much less on a one-to-one basis. And that's when I realized that I was actually, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I had no idea that I was that close to feeling like that. I feel like I was very well supported in that situation. As soon as it was known that, well, it wasn't hard for it to be known because I was crying uncontrollably. I had to leave the building. Luckily, school hadn't started yet. And, I was that that lesson was taken off of me. It was given to someone else, which I'll get back to in a moment. And, the head teacher and the management, they were very sympathetic and asked me if there's anything they could do for me and help me. And, I think that in some cases, teachers wouldn't get that kind of support. And it was really the onus was on me to read the signs that I was leading up to this point. But like I said, when you're so busy, do you always notice what you need? You're putting everybody else
You
first,
don't.
you know? You're putting
You
everybody
don't
else first. You're
notice.
responding to these situations. Student, this happened to a student, that happened to a student. You need to do this. Like, it's very difficult to be in touch with all of those things that you're going through.
Well, because you
Um,
don't have the headspace, right?
well, exactly.
You literally do not have the headspace to even take a moment to do a body check, to do a mind
Absolutely. A
check,
body
to
check,
do
mind check.
a,
Exactly.
yeah. I
Yes.
know that after I had, because I was teaching, I was actually working two different teaching assignments the year after I had Camille.
Mhm.
And I can remember driving to work and thinking, I don't remember the last time I took a shower. I
Right.
mean, because I was just, my head was so full and my schedule was so full, I didn't have time to do anything but react and
React.
do,
Exactly. And
yeah,
teaching is full of those situations, right? Argument in the classroom, inappropriate
yeah.
behavior. I mean, you have to react to that and everything falls, it's health and safety concern, child welfare concern. There's so many priorities. So yes, and I would say that, the one thing that although I was supported and I felt very much that the management were then really looking out for my welfare and my well-being, that job ultimately fell on another teacher who, I believe she was struggling as well, and it did hurt that that situation couldn't be resolved by someone who actually had more time and more headspace and more, just availability. So yes, I was rescued from this, but it did fall on someone else, and
Yeah.
that was unfortunate. But yeah,
I
saying that
think I
it's
think
really
this is
important to.
something that happens pretty frequently. We all know we have more jobs than there are people to do them. So those jobs get split up and sent out to all of us. And it is the people who have a boundary and say, I'm not doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the people, and I'm not going to speak for you, but I'm a
Mm-hmm.
people pleaser and
Mm-hmm.
I see the necessity in the work that needs to be done. And I will say yes, even when I know I should say no. And
Mm-hmm.
so you're right. There are the people that end up getting these that they are overwhelmed as well.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we keep ourselves healthy and mentally safe, emotionally
Yeah.
safe? Um, and have those
Yeah.
good boundaries. It's a
Yeah. And
challenge.
do we feel like we can say no when,
Right.
the job spec encompasses so much? Oh, well, that's in your job spec. It's like, yeah, but I mean, I can't, there is, I think, a lot of times where you just feel like you can't say no. Who else is going to do it? It's your responsibility. It's your student.
Well,
It's your this,
and
you
how
know?
many years have you been at that school? Are you looking to be promoted to another
Well,
department? Are you,
exactly.
all of
Mm,
those pieces factor into it as well. If you're
mhm.
me, how many times have you already been in trouble? So that always factored
Exactly.
into how far I would push things.
Definitely.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I think that probably if we dig deep, every educator that I've had on here has tiptoed into that burnout pool. And I'm really moved by what happened to you because I think it speaks to what happens to a lot of educators, which is we are in chronic stress so
Hmm.
long that we no longer recognize it as chronic stress. And my
100%.
understanding of chronic stress is that that brain is in that too frequently in that fight, flight, or freeze stage. And so
Hmm.
you are generating all of the chemicals that go along with that to cope. And that has a long term negative effect on just about every system in the body.
Yes.
So it makes perfect sense to me that, and I love that you use, because I was thinking when you said it, the straw that broke the camel's back. It is
Mm.
that moment of, it was just that one extra thing too many. And the body let you know. Mm-mm.
Yeah,
And I don't know if you listened to Sam's interview. I don't remember which
I
episode that
did.
was, but he had
Yes,
a very similar story where
exactly.
it was just a, a student asked him a question
Yeah,
and boom, he was there. It was that
yeah. That is such
body
a
letting
trigger
you know.
question, isn't it? Are you okay? Because that question is coming from concern and somebody's picked up on it. And
Yep.
it really can be, yeah, a real catalyst for the tears, I'd say.
I agree. I agree. Okay. So, my other question for you is, you know, for every one of us that has experienced burnout and gone through that process, we also have those moments that no matter how far or wide we go in and out of education, we remember those moments where we were living our best teacher life. We all use, I think the majority of educators go into it because they want to have an impact, they want to make a connection, and they want learning to be the center of that. And
Mhm.
I'm curious, can you think of a time where you were like, this was a win for me? You left school that day and you had your teacher glow on.
Yes. I couldn't say it was a day, actually, although I'm sure I've had those days where, that kid just shows you that you being in their life has had an impact on them. However, I would say in my first few years of teaching, where I was running these projects, it was part of coursework. It was for students to get out in the community and try and make a change or an impact in a certain area. For me, teaching has always been about helping others make an impact, showing them how they can make an impact, right? Because I'm teaching you to set you out into the world. If you always need me, then I'm not doing my job. And so, these students were developing all sorts of skills like critical thinking and research and perspective taking, how would that affect this group or that group? And it was lovely to see how involved they got in trying to make a change. And that was a glow moment for me because not only were they learning about their agency, which for me is like top of the list, knowing that you can affect change, you can make things better. And this is how. not just this, wishy-washy statement like, you can make it better. It's like, no, here are the skills that you're going to learn, and this is what you can do to actually change something. It was a glow moment for me, and I think even more so looking back now, where we look so much at anxiety in students. And I love to put anxiety and agency, just put them right alongside each other and say that if you don't feel like you have agency, you're going to suffer more from anxiety because
Yeah.
you feel like you're stuck in a situation. And so now, with all these rising levels of anxiety, I feel like that was for me an experience that has kind of shaped my idea of where teaching should go in general. Problem solving, getting students really involved in real life problem solving,
Yeah.
while learning valuable skills to take them through life. I mean, if that's not what school's about, I honestly couldn't put it in a nutshell any neater than that, for me at least.
I wish I knew. Today's episode was produced and edited by me. The theme music is by Otis McDonald featuring Joni Inez. If you know someone who might enjoy these conversations, please share the podcast episodes as much and as often as you can. It's as simple as copying the link you use to access today's episode and sending it in a message or sharing it on social media. I'm a small, independent operation, and your shares broaden our audience. Perhaps you or someone you know will be inspired to talk about teacher burnout. If you would like to get your voice on my podcast, contact me via the link on my webpage, taught.buzzsprout.com. Coach, speaker, and author Rashid Ogunlaru said, "It may take many voices for people to hear the same message." Join me in being one of the many voices rising up to get the message out around educator burnout. This is Melissa LaFour. Thank you for listening to Taught, the podcast. I wish I knew. I have an important reminder/disclaimer to share. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Content provided on this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be taken as professional advice. We encourage you to do your own research and consult with qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the information discussed in this or any other episode. Additionally, any opinions or statements made during the podcast are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual. Listener discretion is advised. Thank you for tuning in.